We got those important basics now. We learned how Vue generally works and how we can output content on the screen, how we can react to user input. Now, with the knowledge we got thus far, we'll be able to build a lot, but there are important missing pieces. And in this module, we're basically going to dive into those pieces. We'll learn how to render content conditionally, so how to render some parts on the page only if certain conditions are met, and how to output lists of content. For example, a list of course goals, a list of products, which should be rendered dynamically. And new items should be rendered when the list grows. Items should be removed if the list shrinks. This is what we'll dive into in this module. Specifically, we'll therefore dive into how to render content conditionally, so which tools Vue gives us to make sure that certain text is only shown if we got no products to be rendered, for example. We'll then learn how to output lists of data, so how to output a list of goals or a list of products, for example. And we'll have a first look behind the scenes of Vue and learn about one important optimization or one important feature when it comes to outputting lists of data. But let's get there step by step and let's get started with conditional content. So here's a little starting project with which I want to start. And what exactly is the problem here? What can we do with Vue to make this project better? Well, for one, my goal, no pun intended, is that we can add goals here, like finish the course, and when we then press add goal, currently nothing happens, that goal should be added as a goal in a growing list. If we have a look at the index.html file of the starting project, which by the way is attached to this lecture, of course, then you see in there, I got an unordered list with one dummy list item at the moment. And my goal is that the items we're entering here should be added to this list. And we also should be able to then click on those list items to remove them from the list. But that's just one thing which I want to implement with you in this module, and you will learn how that can be done with Vue. But for a start, I actually want to focus on something else. I have this message here. No goals have been added yet. Please start adding some. And at the same time, I'm rendering this unordered list with dummy goal. The dummy goal because currently we have no way of outputting actual goals. If we have a look at the JavaScript file in the starting code, you see I already created a very simple Vue app for you there, which is connected to the DOM and which has some data. Though the data it does have is just a goals array with an empty array initially. And now here's my problem which I want to solve with Vue. If this array is empty, as it initially is, then this unordered list should not be shown, it should not be part of the DOM, and instead this paragraph should be shown. On the other hand, if we do have goals, because we added some here in JavaScript, or because later we added code to grow this list here, if we do have goals, then I want to show this unordered list, I want to render this in the DOM, I want to include this in the page, and I don't want to show this paragraph. So we need conditional rendering. And if you think about modern web applications, that is something you need a lot. If you, for example, have a web application that fetches data from a server, you might want to show a loading spinner whilst you're waiting for the data to arrive. This is actually something we'll build together a little bit later in the course. So showing different content conditionally when certain conditions are met is a typical problem you have in front-end web development. And Vue makes it easy for us to solve it. Let's see how we can render content conditionally with Vue. So as outlined, I want to show this paragraph if we have no goals. So if this goals array here is empty. And I want to show this unordered list if we do have goals. So if we have at least one item in this goals array. That's my idea here. Now, how can we implement this? First of all, you already noticed, I'm no longer using this split screen. I no longer have JavaScript and HTML on top of each other because I think we got used to how Vue works with HTML, and I now want to have more space available for HTML and JavaScript. Hence, I'll just switch between those files. But that's just a side note. How can we now make sure that this paragraph only shows up if we do have no goals? So if goals is an empty array. Well, Vue has a directive for us. A directive we can add on the element that should be rendered conditionally. And that's the v-if directive. So it's basically like a if statement in JavaScript code. You check a certain condition, and then you have code that is executed if that condition is met. And we can do the same in HTML with v-if. We pass a certain condition between the double quotes here, and as always when using Vue directives, here between the double quotes we can add in a JavaScript expression, and we can also refer to our data, our methods, our computed properties, and so on. And here we can check if goals length is equal to 0. Goals is simply this data property I defined before. It's an array, and therefore it has a length property, and if length is 0, that means we have no goals. And then this condition is met, and this tells Vue that then this paragraph and all its content, including any possible child elements we might have, should be rendered. So if I now save that and reload, nothing changes because initially goals is empty. But if I go to app.js and I do add a goal here, like finish the course, a simple string, let's say, if I do that and reload, now you see the paragraph is gone. And it's not just gone visually on the screen. If we inspect this, we see in the developer tools, it's really not there. We have the unordered list, but we have no paragraph. Instead, we have this placeholder, which Vue uses internally to find out where to add the paragraph if our goals should be empty again. But that's what we get thanks to v-if. Now, in a static application, which isn't truly dynamic, because we have no way of changing goals right now, this is not too exciting, but it is a start. Now, let's make it a bit more exciting though. Let's say when this button is pressed, we want to get the value entered in this input and use that as a goal, which then is added to this goals array. To implement that, we can add a method in the methods option here. Add goal sounds like a fitting name. And in my data object here, besides storing the goals, I also want to store whatever the user currently entered in this input. So here I have my entered goal value, which is an empty string. Of course, you can name the property however you want. And here in the add goal method, I can now reach out to goals and use the push method, which is available on every JavaScript array, and therefore, of course, also on that array, to push this entered goal value, so whatever the user entered here, to my goals as a new goal. And now in index.html, we can bind both things. We can bind the input with vModel to this entered goal value data property like this. And on the button with add click, we can point at this method which we added. So at the add goal method, and point at it so that this method is executed when the button is clicked. And now we do have a way of changing our goals. That means that we now can also get rid of this hard-coded goal here, so that we start with an empty array again. And if we now save everything and reload, we see that we start with this paragraph, but now, if I add a goal like finish the course and click the button, you see the paragraph disappears. We don't see the goal yet because we haven't learned how to output that, but we see that the conditional rendering with v-if works. Now let's dig a bit deeper into v-if. There are a couple of things that are worth knowing about VIF. For one, you can have any expression in here that yields a truthy or falsy value, just as in a regular if statement. In here, you can also check whatever you want, and it will be interpreted as truthy or falsy by JavaScript. You can, of course, also combine conditions here with and or. That works. You can also point at a computed property. You can point at a data property. You can execute a method here, as long as that method returns a truthy or falsy value. That is all possible. But besides that, which should be fairly obvious, since it's really just like if in your HTML code, so it works like if in JavaScript, just in HTML. But besides that, there also is another directive you can use in conjunction with VIF. Because of course we don't just want to show this paragraph conditionally, we also want to show the list conditionally. And we only want to show this list if we do have goals. That means we can add VIF on that too, and we can check if goals length is greater than 0. Because only if it's greater than 0, only then we want to show this list. If we save and reload, we therefore only see the paragraph initially. But if I then add a goal, the paragraph disappears, and instead we see the list with that dummy goal initially. This works, and there's nothing wrong with it. But essentially, this is a little bit like the else case in a JavaScript if statement, right? And there you can also have else and even else if. That's all supported in JavaScript. And Vue also supports this in HTML with its directives. Instead of repeating VIF here, which you can do, but instead of doing that, you can also specify VElse. The only important thing is that VElse has to be used on an element that comes directly after an element with VIF on it. You can't have another element in between. If we have a paragraph in between, that would not work. VElse needs to be used on a direct neighbor element of the element which has VIF. This works, an element in between breaks it. But with that I can reload and get the same behavior as before. Now sometimes you also have scenarios where you have multiple possible conditions. And that's why you also have a VElse if condition, where you can check if goals length is, let's say, greater than 0. And then you could have another element with VElse in case that's not met and that's not met with your fallback content. In this case, that would kick in for a negative length, which of course can't occur, but I'm just showing this as an example. So VIF, VElse if, and VElse can be used to control which parts of your HTML code are really showing up on the final page. And I want to emphasize that it's not just about showing and hiding stuff. It's really about including those elements in the DOM or not including them. It's really about attaching and detaching. If you inspect this paragraph, you of course see that this paragraph is there, but there's no list below it. Now, if I add a goal like finish the course, watch what happens when I press the button. Watch here on the right side. You see, now the unread list was added and the paragraph completely disappeared. Now, because of VIF and VElse combined, by the way, Vue also doesn't need the placeholder anymore. But that's just a side note. So that's VIF, and that's very, very, very useful for showing content conditionally, which turns out is something you'll need in a lot of applications you're going to build. And this is how easy it is to implement it with Vue. Now, there is an alternative to VIF. There's nothing wrong with VIF, but there also is VShow. VShow doesn't work together with VElse or VElse if. It only works standalone, and therefore if you have multiple alternatives, you really need to use multiple VShows. That's one difference. But what does VShow do then? It seems to be more complicated. It doesn't have the simplifications with VElse and VElse if. So why would we use VShow? There's one important difference regarding its behavior. If I reload we don't see a huge difference. It works in the same way. But let me reload again and let's inspect this. And then you'll notice a difference. The paragraph is there, but so is the unordered list. And the only difference is that the unordered list is hidden because its display style is set to none. And that's the difference. VIF really removes and adds elements from and to the DOM. So it really impacts which elements are part of the DOM. vShow, on the other hand, just hides and shows items with CSS. Now, which approach is better? Showing and hiding with CSS means that you don't have to add and remove elements all the time, which can cost performance. Adding and removing elements can cost performance. On the other hand, it also means that you have a bunch of elements in your DOM which you don't really need at the moment, which also is not ideal. Therefore, as a rule of thumb, you should typically use VIF and only fall back to vShow if you have an element which visibility status changes a lot. So if you have like a button that toggles an element and it's switching between visibility and being hidden all the time, that is when you might want to consider vShow. In other cases, use VIF. And that's why I'm going to switch back to it, but I want to show you vShow as an alternative because, of course, it is important to know that as well for situations where you have content that switches a lot between being visible and being hidden. So we learned about VIF, which is great for showing content conditionally. But we also have an array of content here. Potentially we have multiple goals. And it would be nice if we could output those actual goals, which we store in our Vue app, instead of this dummy goal. Well, of course, Vue has us covered for that as well. We now need to output a list of content. And that's also something you commonly have to do in apps. Consider lists of products, users, to-dos. Lists are everywhere in web apps. And therefore, of course, Vue gives us a tool for working with lists of data and outputting repeated content. Here, we want to repeat this list item with different content for all the goals we have. And Vue has another directive for that, the v-for directive. And you might see a pattern here. We have VIF just as we have if statements in JavaScript. And we have v-for just as we have for loops in JavaScript for dealing with repeated code. And it's the same logic here. v-for is there to help us output content that's repeated. So for example, here, we want to output the same list item over and over again for every goal which we have. And we can do this by setting a value to v-for, and between those double quotes, as always with those Vue features, we can execute a JavaScript expression. And here, we can point at goals, which is our data property that holds the goals array. But not just like this. Instead, in a for loop in JavaScript, we have something like const goal of goals. This is how a for loop could look like in JavaScript. It looks quite similar in Vue. Here, we want to go through all goals, but of course we also want to get hold of each goal so that we can take that goal's text, for example, and output it between the list item tags. That's why the v-for syntax looks a bit different. We have goal in goals. Goal of goals also is supported, but you should use goal in goals, which is a bit different than the standard for loop in JavaScript, but you just have to memorize it like this. We loop through an array with the in keyword when using v-for, and now this name here, goal in this case, is totally up to you. You can name it G or GO or hello, whatever you want. I'm going to go for goal because this will hold every goal in goals for every iteration v-for does for us. And v-for will go through all the goals and give us access to every goal here. And why is that useful? Well, our goals are just strings in the end. We just add whatever the user entered, which is a string, to goals. So goals is an array full of strings. So every goal here is also just a string, and hence here between the opening and closing list item tag, we can use double curly braces to output goal like this. And this now has to be goal here if you used goal here. If you used hello here, for whatever reason, it has to be hello here as well. But I'm using goal, so let's revert that. Now what this does is it tells Vue that it should repeat this list item for all the goals in goals. So render as many list items as we have goals in the goals array, and give us access to every goal. And then inside, and that's really important, inside of the v-for controlled element, so between the opening and closing tags of that element, and also on the element itself, we have access to that goal. We don't have access to goal outside of the list item element here. So if I tried to output goal here in another paragraph, which is not inside of the list item here, that would not work. And I guess that makes a lot of sense. In regular JavaScript, if you have a for loop, even though it looks a bit different, if you have a for loop here, you also can't use this constant outside of the for loop. And it's the same with v-for. So now this will repeat as many list items as we need for all our goals and output the goal text in our case between the list item tags. So if I now save that and reload this page, we can add finish the course, click add goal, and here's our goal. We can also add master view, click add goal, and here's the second goal. And you see that this list grows with every new item we add. And this is v-for and why it matters, because now we can really build a dynamic application where we render lists of content and also update that list when the content changes. And Vue does that updating for us. And it also does it in a smart way. If you inspect the list item here with the DevTools, I mentioned before that the parts which are updated in the DOM will flash. So if I add a new goal, watch what happens here on the right to those first two existing list items. You see, they did not flash. Only the third one, the new one, did. And that is how Vue updates the DOM. It does it in a very efficient way, leaving the unchanged list items alone and only adding a new list item, which of course is great for performance. It would be bad if Vue would re-render the entire list with every new item that we add. This would not be good for performance, and thankfully Vue doesn't do it. It's just important to be aware of such things because that helps you understand a bit more how Vue works under the hood. Now let's dig a bit deeper into v-for. We're using v-for with an array like this, and that is honestly also probably the most common way of using it. But v-for has a couple of interesting variations. For one, you can, for example, pull out more than just the array item. You can also get the index of the item in the array. And doing so is simple. You just wrap your item, which you're pulling out of the array with every iteration, between parentheses, and then add a comma, and now you can add a second item here, give it any name you want, like index or idx. I'm going for index here, and this will be the index of this item. So that's another syntax supported by Vue, getting not just the item itself, but also its index with this notation. And now here, we could, for example, add a dash, and that's not special Vue syntax, that's just a dash. And then again, add interpolation to also output the index if we want to. I'll quickly reformat that. And if I save that and reload, if I start adding goals, you see here, this has the index 0 because it was the first goal I added. Master view has index 1, and so on. So that can also be useful in cases where you need the index. Now, you can also loop through more than just arrays. You can also loop through objects. Now here, goals is an array, and you will probably most often loop through arrays. But in case you had a different scenario, you can also loop through objects. I'll quickly add a second unordered list here with a second list item with a second v4. And here I want to loop through an object where I have my name and my age. You could, of course, create that in your data property in the Vue app. I'm doing it here in HTML, quick and dirty, but of course, if this would be a real app and a real example, you might want to move that into your JavaScript code. But now we have this object here, and I want to loop through it and its properties. v4 supports that as well. Again with the in keyword, and here I had to reload, by the way, that's why it's empty here on the right again. But here you can now get your different values stored in the different properties and output those between the list tags with interpolation again. And if you save that and reload, you see max and 31 because these are the values of those properties. Now, just how you can get the index for looping through arrays, you can also get the key name when looping through objects by wrapping this into parentheses, and then the second element you can pull out of this loop is the key. So that here you could also output the key with interpolation, then maybe a colon, which is just plain text, and then the value. And now you would see name colon max, age colon 31. And if you needed it, you could also get the index here, though of course that will probably rarely be the case, but that is also supported here. So you can also get the index just by adding it as a third element here if you're looping through objects. We don't really need it here for this demo app, but of course it is important for you to be aware of what v4 can do, and well, looping through objects is one of the things it can do. I'm nonetheless going to comment this out, because we don't need it here, but you should be aware of it. You should be aware of the fact that v4 can be used with object as well, and that you can retrieve the value, or the value and the key, or value, key, and index, if you needed that. One other thing you can do with v4 is you can loop through a range of numbers. You can also use it like this, and then output the numbers 1 to 10, for example. So whenever you need something like this, looping through a range of numbers by simply using v4 with in and then some number, that also works. Again, not something we need here, but something you should be aware of since, well, that is also something you can do with v4, and who knows, maybe you need exactly this behavior in your next application. With that, however, I'm going to comment this out, and I'm going back to our demo application with the course goals here. We're now able to add goals and to output them here in our list, and that's great. Now let's also make sure that we can remove items from the list to make this truly dynamic. So how could we remove items from this list here? Well, we have our list item, which is repeated for every new goal. It's still a regular HTML element though, even though we're using v4 on it. And that means we can still add event listeners to it. For example, a click listener here to react to clicks on the list item. And now let's say when a list item is clicked, we want to remove that respective goal from the goals array. Now for that, of course, in our JavaScript code, we can add a method. Remove goal sounds like a name that makes sense. Now we definitely need some identifier of the goal we want to remove. And I would say since we have the index anyways, we can just use that. So here in this remove goal method, we could expect to get the index as an argument, and then use the splice method, which is also a built-in method in JavaScript, to splice this one element at this index. In case you don't know this method yet, this method used like this will find the element at this index and simply remove it from the goals array. So this remove goal method should remove a goal at this index. Now we just need to make sure we pass in that index. And how do we do that? Well, let's go back to HTML. Here on this click listener, on this list item, we want to point at remove goal. But we also want to ensure that the index is forwarded to that method. So for that, we can call it explicitly by adding parentheses, and we got the index here. And both goal and index can only be used inside of this element which has v4 on it. So that means between the opening and closing tags in any child elements, but also, and that is what helps us here, on the element itself. So we can simply forward index, which is the index we're retrieving with v4, to remove goal. And that will be the index 0, 1, and so on of the goal on which we clicked. So if I reformat that and save that and reload, we can add finish the course and master view and learn all about view. And if I now click on master view, you see that it disappears. And we only have 2 elements. And we can do that with all the elements until they're all gone. And then, thanks to vif, we see our paragraph again. So that is how we could remove items by leveraging this index and by connecting it with a click listener to a method that updates the array. And since we told Vue to output this array with v4, it has this built-in reactivity, which by now you can certainly tell Vue is all about, that automatically goes to the page and updates the list whenever the array changes. It adds more items if we added more items to the array, and it updates the list to remove DOM elements if we removed items from the array. That is all Vue does behind the scenes. And again, I'm really saying that a lot, I know, but that is why Vue is great. That is so much work we don't have to do in JavaScript. I mean, look how simple our JavaScript code is. It's barely any code at all. And yet we got a full dynamic list to which we can add items and from where we can remove items. And writing that with just vanilla JavaScript in the same efficient way without re-rendering the whole list all the time, that would definitely be a bit more difficult. We're almost done with vif and v4, but here's one important addition related to v4, which you have to be aware of since, well, you can see strange bugs if you're not aware of it. Let's say our goal and index here is actually in a paragraph inside of that list item. So it looks like this. Hence, if I master view here, we see it like this. Now let's say besides that, we also have an input here where we can enter some text. And let's also make sure we can actually enter something there, because right now, if I reload and add this, you see whenever I click in there, I also click on the list item and therefore it's removed. We can avoid this by adding a click listener here where we add the stop modifier. You learned about event modifiers before, and this stops propagation, so it makes sure that when we click on the input, the click is only processed there and this click event on the list item is not triggered. We don't have to specify any code that should be executed if all we want to do is stop the event. So now if I reload, we can master view, click in there and type. But I didn't do that to just show you the stop modifier, even though it's good to know. Instead, let me show you a strange bug that you can experience with that. I will also add finish the course as another goal. And now I will actually type in here something, so in the first goal, and now click on it so that this goal gets deleted. And isn't that strange? Something is still there on the second goal. The first one was deleted, so the new first one is the old second one, and it kept something around. Might look like a cool feature, but it's actually a bug. This might become more obvious if I reload and try this again. Master view, finish the course, and now let's do it the other way around. Let's enter something here in the second goal and remove the first one. Now, finish the course had something in this input field a few seconds ago until we deleted the first goal. Now, the old second goal, finish the course is the new first goal, but it lost the input which we had in this input field. And this is definitely not what you want. You could argue that this is a niche scenario, but the problem that causes this is actually a bigger one, which can also lead to performance issues if you don't fix it properly. The problem here is simple. Vue updates the list when you add and remove items. It renders the list in the real DOM and updates it as required. And it tries to do that such that it optimizes performance. That also means that it reuses DOM elements. So if we have two goals here, two DOM elements, and I delete the first one, Vue will actually not re-render the entire list. It will also not delete the first DOM element and move the second one around. Instead, it basically takes the content of the second element and moves it into the first DOM element. And that explains why, if I enter some text here, that text is lost if I delete the first element. Because the first DOM element is not actually removed. Instead, the content of the second one, and with content I mean the dynamic content, so this part with the curly braces, is moved into the old first DOM element. The input element in the first DOM element is still the old one, because the entire list item is still the old first element. Just the dynamic content was moved around. And that's why we lose the input we had on the second element when the content of the second element moves to the old first element's DOM element. I hope I could make it clear what the problem here is. Now this occurs because Vue reuses elements, which generally is good. But sometimes it needs to be able to tell elements apart. Now the problem is, since they all have the same element, the same DOM element, they are all Li elements, there is no unique identification criteria for every rendered DOM element. Yes, the content is different, but thankfully Vue is not going ahead and comparing all the content with each other. That would be super performance intensive. Instead, long story short, there is a simple extra attribute, which is a non-default HTML attribute, which you can add on elements on which you also use v-for. And that's the key attribute. The key attribute, I'm going to say it again, is not a default HTML attribute. Instead, it is an attribute understood and detected by Vue. It's optional, but it is a good idea to add it whenever you're using v-for. And actually, you will also later in the course see that there are many scenarios where you must use it. So it's already a good habit to start using it on all items where you're using v-for. And key wants a unique identification criteria for every item it's outputting here. Therefore, we want to bind it to a dynamic value with vbind, or the shorthand, just a colon. And now in here, we need something that uniquely identifies every goal. You might be inclined to say the index does that, because every goal has its own index, but, well, keep in mind that if I have two goals and I delete the first one, the old second one now has index 0. The index doesn't really belong to the goal content. The index is always the same. The first item always has index 0, for example. So the index isn't strictly attached to the element value in the array. So the index is not really a good thing to use here. Instead, in this case, we could use the goal text itself. Of course, we could enter the same goal text more than once here, but let's assume that's not the case. Then goal is good. More realistic examples would be IDs that you might, for example, already have in your database. And you will see later in the course, once we also talk to a backend and to a database, that in most cases you do have a unique ID. So getting such a unique key per list item in reality isn't too difficult. But here I'll simply use the goal text. And if I now reload and enter finish the course and master Vue, you will see that if I type something here in the second goal, and I then delete the first one, now the input moved together with the second one. because now Vue was able to tell the different DOM elements apart and detect that the first DOM element now needs to be removed in order to not lose any data attached to the second element. And that was a very thorough and long explanation with a lot of behind the scenes stuff. If there's one key takeaway, again, no pun intended, it is that you should add such a key with a unique identification criteria when you're using V4. You should add it to help Vue tell the different elements apart and make sure that state like such an entered value is not getting lost, and also to help Vue behind the scenes do more performance optimizations. So it's time to practice what you learned about lists and conditional content. Here's your assignment. Task number 1 is that you should add some code and a Vue app, because you currently got none, which takes the user input here, and when this add task button is pressed, the user input should be added as a task to an array of tasks. The second task for you now is to then output this list of tasks in this unordered list here. So make sure that all those task items added with the input in the button here are output here. Now the third task is that when this button here at the bottom is pressed, this task list should be hidden or shown. You should toggle between those two modes. As a bonus, also update the text on the button. As always, definitely try it on your own first, thereafter have a look at my solution video to compare your solution to mine. So, were you successful? Let's get started, and let's of course get started by creating a new app here with Vue create app, storing it in a constant, and then mounting it to the assignment ID element, so to this element here. And now to create app, we of course pass our object. Now we need to store what the user enters here and add it when the button is pressed to a list of tasks. So definitely we'll work with some data. And here we need two pieces of data. The entered value, which initially is an empty string, and then the tasks, which is an array, I would say. The entered value can be bound to this input here with vModel, since that's a quick and easy way of, well, getting user input. And the button here, of course, needs a click event, so that we can do something when the button is clicked. And when it's clicked, of course, I want to trigger a method. So let's add methods to our Vue app. And then add a new method with a name of your choice. For example, add task. And here we want to reach out to our tasks array. And with push, we want to push this entered value as a task to this tasks array. Now we're managing a list of tasks. We just need to connect this button here by pointing at add task on its click listener. That's task number 1 solved. Task number 2 is to output this list of tasks, which we manage in the Vue app, in this unordered list. For that, we can use list items here. And I just want to emphasize that you can use V4 on any kind of element though, but typically, of course, you will use it on list items since, well, we're dealing with lists, but you're not restricted to that. Just want to make that clear. But here, a list item makes sense, and we can use V4 to go through all the tasks in tasks. So all the single task elements in our tasks list, which we have here. And task here will simply point at each individual element, and we can then use that, for example, to output it here with the double curly braces. Since task will be a simple string, since we're just pushing this string here, we can just output it like this. Just as a little side note, of course, you can also use V4 on lists that have other kinds of data than strings inside of them. But here we do have strings, and we can output it like this. And hence, if we save everything and reload, and I add my tasks here like finish the assignment. I can click Add Task, and here it is. Learn View might be another task I have, and that all works. Now, as a little bonus, and something you might want to consider always doing, you could add such a key, as I explained. It's technically not required, and for this simple list, you won't really get a benefit by using it, but to ensure that you don't forget it in situations where it does matter, you might want to get used to always adding a key. So here we can then bind a key to task, for example, and use the task text as a unique identification criteria for every task. Of course, if we use the same task text more than once, this technically is not a good key, but we can ignore this here since it's just a dummy example. And also, just to emphasize this, you could also omit the entire key here. For this simple list, it's not needed. We also don't have any input here, which input we could lose. But still, to get used to it, I'm going to add the key here. With that, however, if I reload, it's still going to work as before. Task number 3 now is related to the conditional rendering. We want to make sure that when this button is pressed, we can hide and show the list. So for that, we'll need more data, which we manage. We'll need a data property that allows us to switch between showing and hiding the list. Something like task list is visible. The name is up to you, but this name should be pretty self-explanatory. Initially, let's say it's true. Initially, we want to show the task list on the screen. But I'll add a method, toggle task list, where I want to set this task list is visible to what it's currently not, by adding this exclamation mark here. By using this code, we ensure that if task list is visible is true, it's now set to false, and if it was false, it's now set to true. So with that, we switch between true and false on this data property. Now we can point at toggle task list on this button here by adding a click listener again with add click and pointing at toggle task list. Well, and now with that, we got this task list is visible property. So we can utilize this to show or hide this unordered list. And we can use vIf or vShow here. And I'm going to go for vIf since it's the more important one, but you could also argue that vShow makes more sense here since we're going to change this a lot. But again, I'll just stick to vIf since it's the more common one. And I want to show this if task list is visible is true and hide it if it's not. And since we store a boolean in there, we can just pass this as a condition like this to vIf, and this will ensure that this unordered list shows up if this is true, and it does not show up if this is false. So if we save that, and I reload here, and I add one task, I can click hide and show to toggle here. And you see the list data is not lost in between, it's just hidden when we want to hide it. The bonus task was to also update the text on the button, and here I have two approaches. One is quick and dirty. I add double curly braces here and check task list is visible with a ternary expression. And if that's truthy, I know that the list is currently visible. So I want to show hide list on the button, because if it's visible, we want to be able to press the button to hide it. Otherwise, it's currently hidden. Then the button should allow us to show it again. So the button should say show list. And if we do that, you see I can add an item, click hide list and it's gone, click show list and it's back. This is one way of doing it, the quick and dirty one, but as I also mentioned before in the course, it is a good idea to move complex logic out of the HTML code into our JavaScript code. So we can also cut this, go back to our Vue app here, and add a computed property for that. Because that's one of the scenarios where a computed property makes a lot of sense. And there we could have our button caption and return the result of checking this task list is visible and say hide list here or show list here. So simply return either that or that. And then in the HTML code, just remove this entirely and just output button caption here between the button tags, and button caption is our computed property. So now we outsource that, and therefore you see this still works, but now with a computed property. That was just a bonus, but of course it's also something you already learned about, so it is a nice extra challenge. And that's the assignment solved, and that's in general vif, vshow, and v-for. A couple of very important directives that help you with rendering conditional and list content. So that's it for this module. Another key module, which together with that module before it, forms the foundation of Vue. Now you really already know a lot, all the core basics you need to build Vue applications. And in this module, we of course learned about conditional content and lists. Conditional content is all about the vif and vshow directives, where vif is the more important one, as I mentioned. Vif allows you to render content only if a certain condition is met, and with vif, the element is really added and removed to and from the DOM. With vshown, it's just shown or hidden with CSS. vif can also be combined with velse and velsif to render other elements as alternatives, only on direct sibling elements though. So velse and velsif need to be used on elements directly after vif, not inside vif, but after vif. We also learned about lists and outputting lists of data. For that, we have the v-for directive, which can be used to render multiple elements dynamically. And you learned that v-for can be used with arrays, with objects, and also with ranges, so with numbers. We also had a couple of variations there. For example, you can extract values and indexes, or even values, keys, and indexes if you're working with objects in v-for. And if you need v-for and vif together, as we had it in the assignment, don't use them on the same element, use a wrapper with vif instead. For example, use it on a template, a div, a UL element, or whatever makes sense in your application. Don't use them on the same element. In addition, v-for has this concept of keys that you might consider using. You need it whenever you have state in your list items, because Vue reuses DOM elements to optimize performance, but this can lead to bugs if your list item elements contain some state that should move together with the content. For that, you can use keys, and you should bind them to unique values so that Vue has a clear way of identifying every element in a unique way.